The problem is they are not a minority. The problem is actually the other way around. If you look at those groups of Muslims, those individual Muslims who are world-oriented, who have found some balance between modernity, civil society, living under secular rule or living or aspiring to that, and what we have now come to call the radicals, a term, by the way, that does not exist in the Muslim world. If you compare that in numbers, what you will see, and that is the frightening thing, is that those truly liberal Muslims are seen to be freaks in the Muslim world. Among the 1.5 billion, they are a minority. You can list them. There are a group of people called the Ismailis with Aga Khan. So they've modified the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. There are the Sufis, there are the Ahmadiyas, there are the Baha'is. They're all minorities. They have difficulty getting into Mecca. They seem to be very, very freakish and as heretics. If you look at the popularity ratings of someone like Bin Laden, the Islamic Brotherhood, Jama'at al-Islamiyya, that's on the rise, including the 4 countries that you mentioned: Turkey, India, Indonesia, and you somehow delightfully said, except Pakistan, a non-Arab country, about 30 years ago, seemingly liberal, today veering off the rails. A majority of the Pakistani parliament have adopted a law saying that if you leave Islam, you're going to be killed. We are no longer talking about minorities. We are talking about either a very significant elite of minorities, very influential in non-Islamic countries, or an rapidly increasing majority in Muslim countries. If you have elections today in Egypt, the current administration wants to bring democracy defined only as holding elections. You will be stunned that Egypt might elect a fundamentalist president. Everyone who thought we'll give the Palestinians a moment to elect their own prime minister, president, whatever they own, they elected Hamas. We were all stunned by it. So the argument that the number of radicals is a minority who have hijacked the faith is simply untrue. And what these radicals say is in the Quran and is the example of the Prophet Muhammad is consistent with their program. The yearning for the caliphate, the establishment of Sharia law, and people, more and more Muslims, finding that to be consistent with whatever it is that is to be Muslim. Is it possible for the liberal Muslims to modify and do to Islam what Christians and Jews have done to their religions, to pacify it and to make it compatible with modernity and with civil society? That is possible. But the condition is, as long as those people who want to do that are not limited by vested interests like the Saudi royal family, they are not killed, then they have a good chance of doing that. And what I can observe, and I can only tell you what I can observe, is if you go from the 11th of September, that's when I first took an interest in this subject. Before that, I was just leading a nice little rosy life. Before that, most of us were indifferent to Islam. But if you just see what happened between the 11th of September until now, it seems as if there is a tiny minority, like Irshad Manji, Tawfiq Hamid, a number of these who have become extremely prominent. This is the minority, Ibn Waq, who say, you can change the faith, you can adopt, you can admonish, you can modify it, you can this and that. But that there is no majority. The silence among the so-called moderate Muslims is deafening. And for academics, then you're forced to go back, sit behind your desk, and review the truths that we've been telling and the facts that we've been selling. That haven't been facts, but have been theories.
Thank you very much. I think we've got time for just one more question.
Here. Ayaan, thank you so much for coming. For me to be in a room with you tonight is really the highlight of my time here for the Aspen Institute. I wondered if you could elaborate a little bit on what I read a few months ago when I read your book, about your take on the schools in Holland, where Holland is a very liberal country, where they allowed the Muslim schools to develop, that in turn ended up being a problem for them. And I see that sort of in the United States, where we feel like we want everybody to be able to pursue their own religions. And I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit further on that, and if that was my right take on having read your book. But
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there are different stages. So the first time when, no, let me start in a different way. The Netherlands, like other European countries, became immigration countries, I think, after the 60s. Before that, they were so-called emigration countries. So very poor Dutch people, very poor British people, very poor Italians, Portuguese, blah, blah. They left. They came here, went to Canada, went to Australia, and so on. After the Second World War, after Europe was rebuilt, and after economic prosperity, people started to come to Europe. Governments that had become welfare states responded to the first wave of immigration by calling it they call the first immigrants guest workers, and that's precisely what they came to do. They came to work, earn a bit of money, and then they went back to their countries. But then the economies in the countries people came from, mainly Muslim countries, did not improve. If they were non-Muslim countries and they improved, like for instance, we had immigrants in the Netherlands from Spain, from Portugal, from Italy. They came, they worked, they earned money, they went back. With the Muslim countries, that did not happen. Morocco and Turkey, those are the major countries. Not going back meant establishing a life and getting access to the welfare state, bringing your family. So the communities got bigger and bigger. And then at one point they said, there are Christian schools, there are Jewish schools, we also want Muslim schools. And it's also it coincided with around the same time that the radical branch of Islam, the jihadism or Wahhabism or whatever name we have given to it, from Saudi Arabia and the other Gulf states was coming into the Netherlands. So you didn't get the Moroccan immigrants who could hardly read or write, who could hardly understand the system, going about getting their own schools. They were stimulated from the Wahhabi, the jihadist methods. They established these schools. Now, first, in a democracy, and to get access to it, and also to climb on the social ladder, you had to have access to proper education. My main problem with Islamic schools in Europe and in other places is, for Muslim children going there, they get excluded from proper education. They get excluded from mixing with the natives so that they can learn the non-verbal and the social codes and the cultural codes that can help them improve, or at least be different from the generation before them. Then you have, on the school boards, imams, or whatever, we call them imams, but very radical elements that separate girls from boys, that teach the kids to separate themselves from the society that they're a part of. These kids are Dutch children. They're not Moroccans. They're not Turks. They are Dutch. They're born in the Netherlands. But they've been labeled Muslim, and therefore are brought up to pretend as if they live in the countries of origins of their parents, and that excludes them. This is detrimental to them. They become fundamentalists. They are taught to reject the society that they live in. The government says, you know what, we're going to send the inspection in. But how often can you send the inspection in? Once a year? Once in 2 years? All information that we have, that the curriculum is not going well, that the quality of education is low, and that they are being taught anti-democratic and hostile and hostility towards the society that they live in, we learn from the Secret Service. But the Secret Service is not going to be there all the time. So at one point, we had enough information to know that these Muslim schools are bad for the kids, that most of the parents just trust the lot and the destiny of their children to these kids, to these board members and people who say, don't worry, we will make sure that your kids become proper Muslims. And The kids, when they leave at age 16 or at age 18, these schools get hardly any access to higher education or employment and cannot climb up the social ladder. So Muslim schools in Europe are institutions of social exclusion in terms of, assimilating into the labor force of the countries that they live in. And in terms of what goes into their mind intellectually, they're institutions of fascism because they are taught to hate the Jews, they are taught to hate the Christians, the infidels. Girls and boys are separated, girls are taught to submit, and boys are taught to become potential jihadists.
Okay, we're out of time.